In this video, we're going to take a look at how we can go about building a knowledge schema while we're using our blended learning approach. Now, the first thing we need to do is to get a basic idea of what we mean by this term of knowledge schema. It can be defined in many ways, but in a very simple way, it is an organizing framework of information. It takes the information, all sorts of different parts and bits of information, and puts them together in a structured and organizing manner. So let's take a look at an example of a knowledge schema. Now, I've picked this particular one because this is a knowledge schema that I can recognize as a schema, but it doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. I didn't really take chemistry too far within school. So when I look at this, I know that all of those dots mean something, and the numbers and the letters mean something, and the arrangement, there's clearly order and structure to it, but I don't really get it. I don't really understand. I had a particular experience of this when I was helping my daughter with her GCSE science. When we were going through one of these revision guides, and I came across this concept of a salt of a metal. Now, to me, salt is something that you can put in a spoon like that, something that you season your food with. What the salt of a metal was, I didn't know. So I had to reach out to a friend of mine who's a science teacher and ask a question: help, what's the salt of a metal? Back came the answer. Now, I am informed that this answer is very good and very detailed and very accurate. But again, I read it and I couldn't really make sense of it because I didn't have that kind of knowledge schema in the back of my mind, or the forefront of my mind even better, to help me to understand these things. So how then do we use knowledge schema whenever we're doing this blended learning? Because what if we give information out to the students and they don't have that organizational framework and structure to assimilate the material in? What if they look at something like this and go, help, what's the salt of a metal? How do we, in the blended learning approach, help with that? Well, we use the knowledge schema as this organizing framework. So the idea is that we'll make explicit some of these key concepts that the students will need to know. There'll be the hangers there. So in this case, it'll be the salt of the metal, what that means. And then the information that goes into it has somewhere to hang. If I knew what a salt of a metal was, then the information in that grey box could hang on to that hanger and could make sense to me. The schema also gives you the overview of this. It allows you to see the big picture as well as the details, and it allows you then to put the details into the context of the big picture. Now, I was facing a particular situation with one of my classes during this blended learning time to do with the geographical process of inquiry. We were moving on to our fieldwork paper, and the spec asks us to look at a whole range of different steps and stages that there are in the geographical process of inquiry. Now, I put them into a table format like this, and I bullet pointed it like this. I even put some of those little icons on to try and represent it. But my feeling was that I wanted to have a way of helping them to get that big picture clear in their mind. Each one of those bullet points we needed to unpack in considerable detail. And I wanted them to be able to step back and to get that big picture in their mind and to see how everything relates together. It's the old saying that you can't see the wood for the trees. I didn't want them to get lost in the middle of the forest looking at the individual detail of each part of each branch, which of course they needed to know. But I wanted them all to also to be able to stand back and to see where this all fitted in. Now, that table does give them that, but it's not in the most accessible of formats. So how can I help my students when I'm not in the room with them, when I'm doing this through the blended learning? How can I help them when they look at that table, not to have my experience when I look at this table? And I'm going to suggest that there are a couple of things that you can do to help with that. The first one is linking through to prior learning. Now, the next little thing I'm indebted to Oliver Cavaliglioli for this one because he has presented this, and it's a really good way of showing exactly how we make sense of new information based on what we already know. The prior learning is very, very significant. So in this particular case, which two of those would you put together? Now, the answer to that question actually depends on your prior knowledge. It depends on your prior learning schema. You might have put B and C together based on pattern. You might have put A and B together based on colour. But you might have put B and C together based on the fact that they are football teams that both play in the city of Manchester. Now, if you didn't know that, if you're not into football, you wouldn't have that information at hand, and therefore it's highly unlikely that you would have interpreted the new information in that manner. So linking through to prior knowledge is a very, very important and useful way to help the students to connect through to the new knowledge. Now, especially I would suggest when we're doing this in blended learning, when we're not in the class being able to make these kinds of links tremendously easily, how do we ensure that our students do that? So back to my geographical process of inquiry, is there anything that they could have learned before that could help me to help them to make those connections? So when I had a little bit of a think about it, I realised we're going through a very structured, very scientific approach to collecting and analysing data. And I thought to myself, well, perhaps they could be using the scientific experiments method. That's something that they will all have done before. It's something that they will have had prior learning and prior experience of. So what I did was got in touch with the science teachers and had a bit of a email exchange with them to try and figure out how I could represent in this kind of schematic form the scientific process of experimentation, prediction, the method you follow, the presentation on a graph, the analysis, the conclusions, and the evaluation. And I presented it in this schema format and then thought, right, well, I can map that on in a schema format, a diagrammatic format, to what I was putting on my table. And here is your geographical process of inquiry. Now, I could, of course, have presented just that bottom line with them and given that to my students. But what I'm seeking to do with this, as I'm inputting this new information, the second step that I'm doing is connecting it back to the prior knowledge that they will have. You will see that there's similarities. You will see that there's some differences. But what I can do is give them this really clear link back so that whenever we're going through step by step, they can make the connection back to what they have already done, and they can then hopefully help them to assimilate the new information in for geography. So at each step as we move through this, I'm adding more and more to the geographical process of inquiry knowledge schema, having linked back to what they did before and building this up so that each one of those little bullet points that they have to unpack, that they have to be able to answer questions on, have a lot more detail. This is the overarching knowledge schema. This is the thing that organizes their learning. This is the thing that gives them that structure and those hangers to hang the detail on. And because I linked it through to the science process first of all, and hopefully what I'm doing is activating the prior experience and learning that they've got in such a way as it helps them to build this new information, this new knowledge schema that's coming in for this one. Just in case you're interested in where you can get those little icons, you get this on a website called the Noun Project, and you can just search for anything like that and you can pull those icons in.